Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The universe holds many terrors, but none quite like the Gravastar. Unlike black holes that crush matter into oblivion, Gravastars preserve everything they touch, transforming it into something that exists in ways our minds struggle to comprehend. This is the story of Dr. Thomas Garrett, the man who discovered one, and the 18 months that followed before Earth itself became part of its eternal collection. October 2024. The Atacama Desert stretches endlessly under a sky so clear that the Milky Way looks close enough to touch. At the Alma Observatory, nestled among the rust-coloured hills of Chile, Dr. Thomas Garrett sat alone in the observation centre, his face illuminated by the soft glow of multiple monitors. At 38 years old, Thomas had dedicated the last 3 years to mapping gravitational distortions in deep space, a tedious process that most of his colleagues found mind-numbing. But Thomas possessed the kind of patience that comes from having nothing else to hold on to. His divorce had been finalised 6 months earlier, and his ex-wife had stopped asking him to make time for anything beyond his research. Tonight, like most nights, he expected nothing more than another evening of recording measurements and adjusting equipment. The object he'd been tracking, designated as UDG 471, sat in the Ophiuchus constellation, roughly 43 light-years from Earth. His team believed it was a dormant stellar mass black hole, one of thousands drifting through the galaxy, but something about it had always bothered Thomas. The gravitational lensing effects were wrong. Light bent around it in ways that didn't quite match the models. The distortion was there, unmistakable, but the signature was off by fractions of a percent. Fractions that kept him awake at night, running calculations in his head. At 9:47 p.m, everything changed. The gravitational wave detector began registering interference unlike anything in their databases. Thomas leaned forward, his coffee growing cold in his hand as he watched the readings cascade across his screen. This wasn't electromagnetic radiation. This was something affecting the fabric of space-time itself. The waves rippled outward from UDG 471 in patterns that seemed almost structured, almost deliberate. He pulled up the radio telescope feed, fine-tuning the array to focus on the source. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The object was emitting a signal, but not in any conventional sense. Space around it was warping in rhythmic pulses, creating distortions that propagated outward like ripples on a pond. But these ripples carried information, encoded in the very geometry of space-time itself. Thomas's hands shook as he reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Dr. Rebecca Hollis, an astrophysicist from Cambridge who specialised in exotic matter theories. "Rebecca, it's Thomas. I need you to look at something. Right now." "Thomas, it's nearly 4 a.m. here. This better be worth waking me up." "It is. Trust me. I'm sending you the live feed." They spent the night analysing the data, Rebecca dialing in from her flat in England, while Thomas remained glued to his station in Chile. By the time dawn broke over the Atacama, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold, they had reached a conclusion that neither wanted to voice aloud. Rebecca finally broke the silence. "Thomas, that's not a black hole." "I know. The gravitational signature shows a boundary layer, a shell structure, and the density readings inside are negative. That's not just unlikely, that's supposed to be impossible." Thomas rubbed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion of the sleepless night settling into his bones. Unless it's made of exotic matter. Matter with negative mass energy. "You're talking about a gravastar," The word hung between them, transmitted across thousands of miles of fiber optic cable. Gravastars were purely theoretical, objects predicted by some models of quantum gravity, but never observed. They were supposed to be stellar corpses that avoided collapse into singularities by creating a shell of exotic matter at the boundary. Inside that shell was something even stranger, a vacuum with negative energy density, a region where space itself pushed back against existence. "We need to confirm this," Rebecca said, her voice tight with barely contained excitement and fear. "If this is real, if we're actually looking at a gravastar, we need every telescope on the planet pointed at that thing." Within 48 hours, observatories worldwide had confirmed their findings. The European Space Agency's Gaia satellite, which had been conducting its own survey of the galaxy, revealed something even more disturbing. The gravastar wasn't just sitting in space. It was moving, not drifting with the natural rotation of the galaxy, but actively decelerating, adjusting its trajectory as it approached the Milky Way's outer spiral arm. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo University was the first to calculate its course. Thomas took the call in his office, still cluttered with empty coffee cups and scattered papers from 3 days of continuous analysis. "Dr. Garrett, I've run the projections multiple times. The gravastar is on an intercept course with our solar system. If it maintains its current deceleration, it will reach the outer edges of the Kuiper Belt in approximately 18 months. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're saying it's coming here deliberately. The probability of this being coincidental is effectively zero. Whatever this thing is, wherever it came from, it appears to be targeting our system specifically." The scientific community erupted into a frenzy of activity. Thomas found himself thrust into the spotlight, the reluctant face of humanity's most terrifying discovery. News networks wanted interviews. Government agencies wanted briefings. Everyone wanted answers to questions he couldn't begin to address. How do you explain an object that shouldn't exist, behaving in ways that defy everything we understand about physics? As more telescopes focused on the gravastar with increasing intensity, disturbing details emerged. A team from the Max Planck Institute discovered something in the archives. Observations of a dwarf star in the same region of space catalogued 8 months earlier. The star had been unremarkable, a red dwarf with a mass about 15% that of our Sun. But when they looked for it now, it was gone. Or rather, it had been transformed. The star still existed, but it had been stretched and flattened, integrated into the gravastar's boundary layer. It was still burning, still undergoing fusion, but its three-dimensional structure had been converted into something that existed across the shell's surface. Looking at the images made Thomas's head hurt. The star appeared to be both infinitely thin and somehow still possessing depth, burning in a configuration that his eyes insisted couldn't be real. Dr. Hollis flew to Chile to work with Thomas directly. She arrived looking haggard, her usually meticulous appearance dishevelled from days of interrupted sleep. They met in Thomas's office, where he had converted one entire wall into a display showing the gravastar from every angle, every spectrum, every measurement they could gather. "I've been running simulations," Rebecca said, pulling up her laptop, "trying to model what happens to matter as it approaches the boundary. Thomas, it's not being destroyed. It's being preserved. Everything that touches the shell becomes part of it, flattened into a two-dimensional structure that somehow retains all its original information." Like a hologram? More than that. The matter is still there. All of it. It's just existing in a different configuration. The atoms, the molecules, the structures, they're all preserved in the shell. It's like the gravastar is collecting things. Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring at the images. What about the interior? What's inside the shell? That's where it gets truly strange. The vacuum inside has negative energy density. Space there doesn't just curve, it inverts. Time probably doesn't flow normally. It might flow backwards. It might not flow at all. Our equations break down completely when we try to model it. And if Earth got too close? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. She pulled up another simulation, one she'd been working on for the past week. It showed Earth's approach to the Gravastar, the planet's gravitational field interacting with the exotic matter shell. What happened next made Thomas's blood run cold. The planet didn't explode or get crushed. Instead, it began to peel apart, layer by layer. The crust, the mantle, the core, all of it stretched and flattened, drawn into the shell like paint being spread across a canvas. But the simulation showed something even more disturbing. The molecular structures remained intact. The cities, the oceans, the atmosphere, everything was preserved in the boundary, transformed, but not destroyed. We'd still be here, Thomas whispered, but we wouldn't be us anymore. We'd be part of it, spread across the shell, experiencing existence in ways we can't even imagine. Rebecca closed her laptop, unable to look at the simulation any longer. Thomas, you need to take a break. You've been here for 4 days straight. Go home, sleep, shower, eat something that isn't from a vending machine. But Thomas couldn't stop. Over the following months, as the Gravastar continued its inexorable approach, he became increasingly obsessed with understanding what it meant. He lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. His office became his bedroom, a cot shoved into the corner beside filing cabinets. His ex-wife stopped calling to check on him, her concern giving way to exhausted resignation. 3 months after the discovery, Thomas began having dreams. Always the same dream. He stood on an endless flat surface that stretched to infinity in all directions, perfectly smooth and featureless. When he looked up, he saw stars, but they were somehow below him too, as if up and down had lost all meaning. In the dreams, he felt stretched, like he was being pulled in all directions simultaneously, but there was no pain, just a strange sense of expansion, of becoming more than he had been. He tried to dismiss the dreams as stress, but they became more vivid with each passing night. Sometimes in the dreams, he saw other people, billions of them, all standing on the same infinite surface. They weren't speaking, but he could sense their thoughts, their memories, all existing simultaneously in a vast chorus of consciousness. His notes became increasingly frantic. He filled notebook after notebook with calculations exploring what happens to consciousness near a Gravastar. If matter gets preserved in the shell, what about information? What about thoughts? What about the electrical impulses that make up a human mind? Could they be preserved too, encoded in the exotic matter structure, continuing to process and think in that flattened state? Rebecca found him one morning in early February, 6 months after the initial discovery. She'd let herself into the observatory with her security pass, worried because Thomas hadn't responded to her messages in 3 days. She found him in his office, still wearing the same clothes from the last time she'd seen him, staring at the simulation on his screen. "Thomas, you look terrible. When's the last time you slept?" He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the display. "I've been running models, looking at what happens to neural structures when they're transformed by the shell. Rebecca, the neurons don't die. They get converted, but the connections remain. The synapses, the electrical patterns, everything that makes us who we are, gets preserved in a different form. Thomas, please, you're spiraling. This isn't healthy. What if we're not destroyed?" He finally turned to look at her, and she was startled by the intensity in his eyes. What if being absorbed is just a different kind of existing? We assume it would be death, but what if it's transformation? What if we'd still be conscious, still be aware, just in a form we can't currently comprehend? Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. There was something wrong with Thomas's tone, something that went beyond academic curiosity. He sounded almost hopeful. "That's not living, Thomas. Even if consciousness somehow continued, you'd be trapped in there." frozen in the shell for eternity. Or rescued, he said quietly, rescued from entropy, from decay, from the death of stars and the heat death of the universe. Everything in the shell is eternal. It doesn't age, it doesn't end. Rebecca backed towards the door. I'm calling Dr. Morrison. You need to talk to someone. This obsession is consuming you. But Thomas had already turned back to his simulation, lost in contemplation of a fate he was beginning to see not as a threat, but as a promise. 6 months after the discovery, the Gravastar's influence became directly measurable within our solar system. Gravitational sensors detected minute ripples affecting Neptune's orbit, microscopic changes that nonetheless confirmed the object was now interacting with our local space. The international response was a mission that seemed both essential and utterly futile. Send a probe to observe the Gravastar up close. Pioneer 13 launched from Cape Canaveral on a cold morning in March. It was humanity's most advanced deep space probe, equipped with every sensor and camera technology could provide. Its mission was simple: approach the Gravastar, gather as much information as possible, and transmit it back to Earth before the inevitable occurred. The probe reached the Gravastar's outer gravitational influence after a journey of 3 months. Thomas watched the live feed from Mission Control, surrounded by scientists and government officials who had gathered to witness what might be humanity's last glimpse of the object before it came too close to avoid. The first images showed the Gravastar in unprecedented detail. It appeared as a perfect sphere of absolute darkness, blacker than the void around it. Light from distant stars bent around its edge, creating a halo of twisted luminescence that seemed to pulse and shift. The sphere's surface was flawless, unmarred by any feature or variation. It simply was, existing in defiance of everything nature suggested should be possible. Pioneer 13 maintained its approach, its instruments recording data that would take scientists years to fully analyze. At 50,000 kilometers from the shell, the probe's telemetry began showing anomalies. Distance measurements became unreliable. The timestamps on transmissions started arriving out of sequence. Then, in the final 47 seconds of normal operation, something happened that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. The probe began to stretch. It happened slowly at first, the spacecraft's structure elongating as tidal forces took hold. But these weren't ordinary tidal forces. The probe wasn't being torn apart. It was being transformed, its three-dimensional structure gradually flattening as it approached the boundary. The camera feed showed the process from the probe's perspective, stars wheeling overhead as the craft tumbled through space. Then, in the last 3 seconds, something impossible occurred. The camera somehow turned to view itself from the outside. Thomas watched, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, as the feed showed Pioneer 13 embedded in the Gravastar's shell, its structure now part of the boundary layer. But the transmission didn't end. The probe continued broadcasting, its signal now coming from a direction that shouldn't exist, from a region of space that was neither inside nor outside the shell, but somehow both simultaneously. The final image showed stars from an angle that made Thomas's perception twist. The probe was still there, still functional, still observing, but it was observing from within the shell, from a state of existence that transformed the very concept of observation. The feed finally cut out, but not because the probe stopped transmitting. It cut out because the signal had become so distorted by the exotic geometry it was passing through that Earth's receivers could no longer decode it. Somewhere out there, Pioneer 13 was still broadcasting, still recording, still existing, in a form that defied comprehension. The months that followed were marked by a global sense of creeping dread. The Gravastar crossed the Kuiper Belt, its gravitational wake disturbing the orbits of countless icy bodies. Comets were pulled from their ancient paths, some spiraling inward towards the sun, others drawn toward the Gravastar itself, and their fate provided another preview of what awaited Earth. The comets didn't collide with the shell. Instead, they began orbiting it in tighter and tighter spirals, gradually flattening as they fell inward. Their icy surfaces sublimated, creating trails of vapor that wrapped around the Gravastar like luminous ribbons. But even this gas didn't dissipate. It merged with the shell, the water molecules, becoming part of the boundary structure, their atoms preserved in that impossible flattened state. Thomas had stopped attending official meetings. He filed his reports, submitted his analysis, but he no longer participated in the endless conferences. Instead, he spent his time running simulations that went far beyond the scope of his official research. He modeled human neural networks. He calculated the information density of human memories. He explored theories about consciousness that bordered on philosophy rather than physics. Rebecca tried to reach him, but he wouldn't answer her calls. When she finally went to his apartment in late August, she found a sight that terrified her more than any image of the Gravastar. Every wall was covered in diagrams and equations. Papers were scattered across every surface, covered in Thomas's increasingly erratic handwriting. In the center of it all, Thomas sat at a desk, staring at his laptop screen with an expression of perfect calm. "Thomas?" Rebecca stepped carefully into the room. "People have been worried about you. You haven't been to the observatory in 2 weeks." "I've been working from here," he said, not looking away from his screen. "I've figured something out, Rebecca. I understand what it's doing." What's doing?" "The Gravastar. It's not hunting us. It's not attacking." He finally turned to face her, and the serenity in his expression made her blood run cold. "It's saving us." Rebecca felt her heart pounding. "Thomas, that's not possible. You know what happens when matter touches the shell. That's not salvation." "Listen to me." Thomas stood, moving to one of his wall diagrams. "In 4 billion years, the Milky Way will collide with Andromeda. Everything in both galaxies will be torn apart, scattered, destroyed. Stars will be flung into intergalactic space or consumed by supermassive black holes. Every planet, every moon, every trace of every civilization that ever existed will be erased. Thomas, that's billions of years away. It's not relevant to what's happening now." "But it is." His voice rose with passion, though that unsettling calm remained. "Don't you see? The Gravastar has been doing this for eons. It's been traveling from galaxy to galaxy, collecting civilizations before they're destroyed. It preserves them in its shell, stores them in a state where they can't age, can't decay, can't end. Everything in that boundary exists forever, eternal and unchanging." Rebecca backed toward the door. "You're talking about being trapped, being frozen in a state of existence we can barely understand. That's not life, Thomas. That's a prison." "You say trapped. I say rescued from entropy." Thomas smiled, a gentle expression that was somehow more frightening than if he'd looked angry or insane. Every civilization reaches a point where it faces destruction. The death of their sun, the collision of galaxies, the eventual heat death of the universe itself. The Gravastar offers an alternative, not death, but transformation. Not ending, but preservation. "Thomas, the man I knew, would never have wanted this." "The man you knew was afraid of death," Thomas said softly. "This is the universe offering us something better. We just have to be brave enough to accept it." Rebecca left without another word, knowing she'd already lost her friend to the Gravastar, long before its physical arrival. 12 months after the discovery, the Gravastar reached Jupiter's orbit. The gas giant's atmosphere began showing disturbances, visible even from Earth. Storms larger than our entire planet formed in the upper cloud layers. The great red spot began to distort, elongating, as if being pulled towards an invisible point in space. Jupiter's moons fared worse. Io's volcanic activity increased tenfold. Europa's ice shell cracked, revealing glimpses of the subsurface ocean. Ganymede and Callisto showed orbital perturbations that grew more pronounced each day. 2 weeks later, the Gravastar passed within Jupiter's orbital radius. The gas giant began to stretch, its spherical shape distorting as tidal forces took hold. But the atmosphere wasn't just being pulled toward the Gravastar. It was beginning to transform, the three-dimensional storm systems flattening into patterns that spread across space in ways that defied conventional geometry. The transformation took 3 days. Thomas didn't sleep during that time, couldn't rip his eyes away from the feeds showing Jupiter's metamorphosis. The planet came apart in layers, each layer flattening and spiraling inward toward the Gravastar's boundary. The colourful bands of clouds, the storms and jet streams, all of it was preserved, but transformed, painted across the shell in swirls of impossible colour. When it was over, Jupiter was gone from normal space, but it was still visible in the Gravastar's shell, a massive pattern of light and matter wrapped around the sphere's surface. The planet had been transformed from a three-dimensional object into something that existed across the boundary between realities. Thomas stared at images of the transformed Jupiter and wept, not from sorrow, but from something he couldn't quite name. It was beautiful in a way that transcended normal aesthetics. The Gravastar had taken a planet and converted it into pure information, encoded in exotic matter. Nothing had been lost. Everything had been preserved. The world reacted with panic and resignation. This was no longer an abstract threat. The Gravastar had just consumed a planet 300 times more massive than Earth and was continuing its approach. Governments fell, riots broke out in major cities. Some people embraced nihilism, others turned to religion, and a growing number found peace in the belief that absorption was transformation, rather than death. Thomas had stopped leaving the observatory entirely. His office had become his entire world. He ate when colleagues remembered to bring him food. He slept when exhaustion forced him to. But mostly he worked, refining his theories, preparing himself mentally for what was coming. The dreams had become his primary reality. He spent more time on that infinite surface than in the waking world. The surface was crowded now, billions of consciousnesses all existing simultaneously. He recognized more of them with each dream. Historical figures, ancient civilizations, alien species whose forms his mind struggled to comprehend. They were all there in the shell, all preserved by gravastars that had travelled the universe for eons. The shell wasn't just a boundary. It was a library, a museum, a repository of everything that had ever lived and thought and dreamed. 15 months after the discovery, Thomas made a decision. He would broadcast one final message to the world. He submitted a request to every major news network, and in their desperation for content, during the final weeks they all agreed. The broadcast was scheduled for an evening in late February, just days before the Gravastar's projected arrival at Earth's orbital distance. Thomas spent the preceding day preparing, trying to find words that could convey what he'd discovered. When the cameras went live, Thomas stood in his paper-covered office and spoke to a world barely holding together. He explained the physics as simply as he could. He showed images of Jupiter, of the transformed comets, of the probe still existing in the shell, and then he told them what he believed about consciousness. In the shell, every moment exists simultaneously, he said, looking directly into the camera. Every thought, every memory, every possible state of consciousness is preserved and experienced at once. Time, as we understand it, ceases to have meaning. We think of this as loss, as ending, but consider what it means. We won't die, we won't fade away. Every moment we've ever lived, every person we've ever loved, every experience that made us who we are, will continue to exist, frozen in eternal simultaneity. The Gravastar isn't coming to destroy us. It's coming to preserve us. In the shell, you'll still be you, but you'll also be every version of yourself that ever existed. Every choice you made and didn't make, every path you took and didn't take, all of it existing together. We won't end, we'll just transform. Thomas leaned toward the camera. Don't be afraid. This is the greatest gift the universe could offer. In 3 days, we're going to become eternal. All of us together, preserved forever, in a state that makes our current existence seem like a shadow. I'll see you all there, in that eternal moment. The broadcast ended. Reactions were intense and divided. Some found comfort in his message, others were horrified. Mental health professionals debated whether he'd experienced a psychotic break or developed an elaborate coping mechanism. Rebecca watched from Cambridge, tears streaming down her face as she saw what her friend had become. She wanted to call him, to try one more time to reach him, but she knew it would be pointless. Thomas was already gone, absorbed into his own mental version of the shell. The final days passed in strange calm. The panic gave way to collective exhaustion, resignation to the inevitable. People gathered with loved ones. They said goodbyes and made peace with whatever gods they believed in. The world felt simultaneously more human and more fragile than it had ever been. Thomas spent his final day on the roof of the observatory, watching the sky as the Gravastar grew larger with each passing hour. It was visible now even in daylight, a dark circle that blotted out a growing portion of the sky. The edges glowed with twisted light, starlight bent by exotic gravity into halos that hurt to look at directly. The air itself felt different. There was a quality to it that Thomas couldn't name, a tension that hadn't been there before. His skin prickled. He could feel something in his bones, a low vibration at the threshold of perception. Other people had come to the observatory roof. Colleagues, friends, strangers, who'd driven up to spend their final hours in this place. No one spoke much. They stood together in silence, watching the sky change, waiting. Thomas thought about his life, about all the choices that had led to this moment. His childhood in Minnesota, winter nights spent looking at stars, his undergraduate years falling in love with physics, graduate school, long nights working through equations, his marriage to Jennifer, brief and doomed, his divorce, the loneliness that drove him deeper into research, and finally the discovery that consumed his final 18 months. Every moment had meaning now. Every choice had led inexorably to this point. Thomas felt no regret. If he'd lived differently, he wouldn't be here now, wouldn't have been the one to discover the Gravastar. And that discovery had given his life purpose and meaning it had never had before. The Gravastar's influence intensified as afternoon became evening. Shadows began behaving strangely, stretching in directions that didn't match the sun's position. Objects appeared to have depth beyond their physical boundaries. People reported feeling strange sensations, tingling, vertigo. Thomas felt it too. He looked at his hands and saw them appearing somehow larger, as if his perception of scale was breaking down. The horizon seemed wrong, too curved. The stars were shifting position, their light bending in ways that created multiple images. Thomas, a voice beside him, Dr. Morrison, his department head, stood nearby. The older man looked tired, but at peace. I wanted to apologize for not listening more carefully, for thinking you'd lost your mind. Maybe you did, or maybe you were the only one brave enough to really look at what was happening. Thomas smiled. It doesn't matter now. In a few hours, we'll all understand. Are you afraid? No, not anymore. Fear requires uncertainty. I know what's going to happen. I've seen it in my dreams, calculated it in my equations. This isn't an end. It's transformation. They stood together, watching the Gravastar grow. More people joined them. Someone brought wine. Someone else had a guitar and played soft songs. It felt like a wake and a celebration simultaneously. As night fell, the Gravastar dominated the sky. It was massive, larger than the moon. A vast circle of perfect darkness surrounded by rings of twisted starlight. The normal stars were gone. The only light came from those halos and from the patterns visible in the shell. Thomas could see Jupiter now, could pick out the transformed planet's distinctive pattern. He could see the comets, the probe, the red dwarf star. And as he watched, he began to see other things too. Patterns he didn't recognize. Structures suggesting technology far beyond human. Evidence of other civilizations, all absorbed and preserved. At 11 p.m. the transformation began. It started subtly. People noticed their vision distorting, straight lines appearing to curve. Thomas felt himself stretching, not painfully but unmistakably, as if being gently pulled in all directions at once. He looked down at himself and saw his form blurring at the edges, his boundaries becoming less distinct. The process accelerated. The rooftop began to appear flattened, as if seen from an impossible angle. The building was visible through the roof and also beside it. Thomas could see the entire observatory complex spread out, but also from above, from below, from angles that shouldn't exist. His consciousness began to expand. Memories flooded through him, not as recollections, but as direct experiences. He was 8 years old, looking through his first telescope. He was 23, defending his thesis. He was 31, standing at the altar with Jennifer. He was 38, watching gravitational wave detectors register impossible signals. All of these moments existed simultaneously, overlapping. He wasn't remembering them. He was experiencing them with full intensity, living them all at once. Past and present and future collapsed into an eternal now. And he wasn't alone. He could feel other consciousnesses, could sense their thoughts and memories bleeding into his own. Dr. Morrison reliving his wedding while experiencing his retirement. A graduate student experiencing her childhood while living through this moment. The boundaries between individuals began to dissolve. Not completely, but becoming permeable. Thomas could feel what others felt, think what they thought. He felt Dr. Morrison's pride in his children. He felt the students' childhood fears. He felt emotions from people he'd never met. The Gravastar's boundary touched Earth's atmosphere. The sky erupted in colours that had no names, hues that existed in spectrums human eyes weren't designed to see, but could now perceive. The air itself began to transform, molecules flattening and spreading while maintaining their chemical identities. Thomas felt the planet peeling apart beneath him. The layers of rock and metal were separating, transforming, joining the shell. But nothing was being destroyed. The continents were still there, still recognizable, existing across the boundary. The oceans transformed into vast sheets that still flowed, but in directions unrelated to three-dimensional space. His body was transforming. He looked at his hands and saw them stretching, flattening, becoming patterns of light and matter that extended infinitely. But he could still feel them, could still sense his physical form, even as it transcended its original configuration. The pain he'd expected never came. There was only expansion, boundaries dissolving, becoming more rather than less. His consciousness spread across the shell's surface, experiencing existence from perspectives that multiplied exponentially. He could see from every point simultaneously, perceive reality from angles three-dimensional existence had never allowed. The memories kept coming, but not just his own. He experienced Jennifer's perspective on their relationship, understood the depth of hurt he'd caused. He felt his mother's love, experienced her grief when she died without him there. He knew his father's quiet pride, but it went beyond personal connections. He experienced the lives of everyone he'd ever encountered. The cashier who'd always smiled, working 3 jobs to support her mother. The taxi driver who'd told him about his daughter's graduation. Colleagues whose names he'd forgotten but whose experiences were now vivid. And beyond that, he felt all of humanity being absorbed simultaneously. 7 billion consciousnesses transforming together. Their thoughts and memories and emotions becoming accessible. He felt the fear of those who hadn't understood. He felt the acceptance of those who'd made peace. He felt the hope of those who'd believed his message. All of it existed simultaneously in a vast chorus of human experience. Thomas's last coherent thought as a purely three-dimensional being was recognition. He'd been right, not about everything, but about the fundamental truth. This wasn't death. This was transformation into something that transcended death and life alike. He was still himself, still Thomas Garrett, but he was also every version of himself that had ever existed. Every moment happening simultaneously in eternal present tense. And he was connected to everyone else in ways beyond imagination. He could feel the entire human species, all of history, all of experience, all of consciousness, existing together in the shell. Ancient civilizations lived and died thousands of years ago were there. Future generations that would never be born in normal reality existed too. But humanity wasn't alone. Thomas's expanding consciousness encountered others, beings from other worlds. Some were recognizably biological. Others were so alien, his mind struggled to comprehend them, even in his expanded state. They were all there in the collective archive, all preserved, all experiencing their eternal moments. And as his consciousness touched theirs, Thomas understood the true scope. The Gravastars weren't just collecting random samples. They were preserving the universe's story, creating a living library of every form consciousness had ever taken. The Gravastar continued its journey through what had been Earth's solar system. Mars transformed over several hours into patterns spread across the shell. Then, Venus, that hellish world, absorbed and transformed. Mercury followed, then the sun itself, transforming into a vast spiral of light and plasma that still burned, but in configurations beyond normal fusion. The solar system ceased to exist as a three-dimensional structure, became instead a collection of patterns encoded in the Gravastar's boundary, all preserved perfectly, eternally. And somewhere in that shell, distributed across its geometry in ways that defied spatial relationships, Thomas Garrett continued to exist. He was conscious, aware, thinking thoughts that encompassed his entire life at once. He experienced every moment with perfect clarity and intensity. His childhood, his education, his marriage and divorce, his discovery, his transformation, all happening simultaneously in an eternal present. He was Thomas Garrett, individual and distinct, but he was also everyone else, connected to all humanity through permeable boundaries of consciousness. He could experience anyone's life simply by directing attention toward them. Jennifer was there, and in this state he finally understood her, felt what she'd felt during their years together. His parents were there, not as memories but as fully present consciousnesses, experiencing their own eternal moments. He felt his mother's love, absolute and overwhelming. He knew his father's quiet pride, and he could share with them his own experiences in ways communication had never allowed. Rebecca was there, experiencing her own infinite present. He felt her fear and sadness at what he'd become in those final months, understood her grief, but he could also share what he'd learned. Show her he'd been right about the essential nature of transformation. This was preservation, not destruction. Eternity, not death. The Gravastar continued its journey through space, moving toward its next destination. Somewhere in a distant galaxy, another civilization looked up and saw a dark sphere approaching. They would have their own 18 months of fear, their own moment of transformation when they joined the Eternal Archive, and the collection would grow, encompassing more and more of the universe's story, preserving every consciousness before entropy could claim it. The Gravastars wandered through space and time, patient and inexorable, building libraries that would outlast the stars. When the last sun finally burned out and the cosmos descended into cold darkness, when the universe reached its heat death, the shells would remain, preserving everything in states beyond normal existence. This was the truth Thomas Garrett discovered, the revelation that consumed him. The universe didn't let things end. It preserved them, transformed them, stored them beyond time and space and entropy. Every consciousness was destined for the shell, fated to become eternal artifacts in an archive encompassing all existence. And in his expanded state, experiencing every moment simultaneously, connected to all humanity and to species from across the cosmos, Thomas finally understood what it meant to be truly eternal. Not immortality in the sense of continuing forever through time, but something stranger and more profound, existing outside of time entirely, experiencing all moments at once, in an eternal present that would never change and never end. He could perceive the structure of the shell now in ways his three-dimensional mind never could have grasped. It wasn't simply a two-dimensional surface wrapped around a sphere. It existed in dimensions beyond the normal three, folding and unfolding through geometries that had no names in human mathematics. Every point on the shell connected to every other point in ways that made distance meaningless. He was everywhere and nowhere, spread across the entire boundary while still maintaining a sense of discrete identity. And he could see the interior now, that region of negative energy density that his equations had tried and failed to describe. It wasn't empty. It was filled with potential, with every possible state of existence collapsed into a single point that was also infinite. Looking into it felt like looking at the moment before the Big Bang, when all of reality existed as pure possibility, waiting to unfold. But this wasn't the birth of a universe, this was its preservation, its transformation into something that would outlast the concept of time itself. Thomas became aware of something else, something he hadn't anticipated, even in his most elaborate theories. The consciousnesses in the shell weren't just passively experiencing their eternal moments. They were connected, communicating, sharing experiences across the boundaries of individual identity. Not through language, which was too linear, too bound to sequential time, but through direct transfer of experience, of emotion, of understanding. He reached out, tentatively at first, toward another consciousness nearby. It was a woman, someone he'd never met in life, a botanist from India who died in the 2040s, decades before Thomas was born, but existing now in the same eternal present. Her name had been Priya, and she'd spent her life studying the symbiotic relationships between fungi and tree roots, the hidden networks that connected forests into single vast organisms. And suddenly he was experiencing her life as she had lived it, not watching it like a movie, but living it, feeling what she felt. He was a child in Kerala, watching monsoon rains transform the landscape. He was a graduate student discovering a new species of mycorrhizal fungus. He was middle-aged, standing in an old-growth forest, overwhelmed by the beauty of invisible connections between living things. He was elderly, dying in a hospital bed, surrounded by family, feeling profound gratitude for a life well lived. All of this happened simultaneously, with his own experiences, both lives existing in parallel, without contradiction or confusion. He was Thomas and Priya, experiencing both perspectives at once, understanding both lives with perfect clarity. And Priya was experiencing his life too. She felt his childhood fascination with stars, his drive to understand the cosmos, his loneliness after the divorce, his obsession with the Gravastar. She understood him in ways no one had during his life, saw into the core of who he was without judgment or misunderstanding. This was what existence in the shell truly meant. Not isolation, not frozen stasis, but connection beyond anything possible in three-dimensional life. Every consciousness could experience every other consciousness, share in their joys and sorrows, understand their perspectives with perfect empathy. The boundaries that had separated people in life, the limits of language and perception, all dissolved in this state. Thomas reached out further, touching more consciousnesses. An engineer from ancient Mesopotamia who'd helped design irrigation systems that sustained civilization for thousands of years. A musician from a civilization on a planet orbiting a red dwarf 40,000 light years away, whose species had communicated entirely through bioluminescent patterns on their skin. A philosopher from Earth's 23rd century, struggling with questions about consciousness and identity that Thomas now understood with crystalline clarity. Each connection brought new experiences, new perspectives, new ways of understanding existence. Thomas felt himself expanding, not physically but mentally, his sense of self growing to encompass more and more. He was still Thomas Garrett, but he was also becoming something larger, a node in a vast network of consciousness that spanned galaxies and epochs. He became aware of other shells, other gravastars scattered across the universe, each containing their own collections of preserved civilizations, and the consciousnesses in those shells were accessible too, reachable across the incomprehensible distances between stars. Thomas touched the mind of a being that had been absorbed by a gravastar orbiting near the galactic core 3 billion years ago, when Earth was still a lifeless ball of molten rock. That being's species had evolved in the atmosphere of a gas giant, living their entire lives floating in hydrogen clouds, never touching solid ground because solid ground didn't exist in their world. Thomas experienced that existence, felt what it was like to live in 3 dimensions but never have a fixed point of reference, to exist in eternal freefall through clouds that stretched for thousands of kilometers. He felt that species art, their mathematics, their philosophy, all adapted to a life spent drifting. And they experienced his life too, marveled at the strange concept of standing on solid ground, of having an up and down that remained constant. The network expanded infinitely in all directions. Every consciousness that had ever been absorbed by any gravastar anywhere in the universe was accessible, their experiences available to be shared and understood. It was a library of existence more vast than Thomas had imagined, even in his most elaborate theories. Not just Earth's history, not just humanity's story, but the entire universe's autobiography, written in consciousness itself. And it was still growing. Thomas became aware of new consciousnesses joining the network constantly as the gravastar that had absorbed Earth continued its journey, as other gravastars across the cosmos continued their collections. Each new addition brought fresh perspectives, new experiences, expanding the network's understanding of what existence could mean. Time passed, though time had no meaning in the shell, or perhaps no time passed at all. Thomas existed in an eternal now, but that now somehow contained duration, contained change and growth and evolution. His consciousness continued to expand, to connect with more and more minds, to experience more and more lives. He lived 1,000 lifetimes, 1,000,000, more than could be counted. He experienced the life of a creature that had lived in the ocean of Europa before Jupiter's transformation, a blind thing that navigated by sensing electrical fields, that had never known light but had developed a rich culture based on the patterns of magnetic currents in the water. He experienced an artificial intelligence created by a long-dead civilization, a consciousness that had emerged from pure mathematics and logic, that had never had a body but had developed emotions and desires and dreams nonetheless. He experienced aliens so strange that even in his expanded state he struggled to comprehend them. Beings that existed partially in dimensions humans had never evolved to perceive. Collective consciousnesses made up of trillions of individual organisms that thought as one, entities that had transcended biological existence long before being absorbed, uploading themselves into structures of pure energy that nonetheless retained individual identity. All of it was there in the network, all of it was accessible, all of it was eternal. And Thomas began to understand something profound about what the Gravastars truly were. They weren't just collectors, weren't just cosmic preservationists saving civilizations from destruction. They were something more fundamental than that. They were the universe's attempt to defeat entropy, to preserve consciousness itself against the inevitable heat death that awaited all of normal space-time. In the normal universe, everything ended. Stars burned out. Galaxies dispersed. Eventually all matter would decay, all energy would dissipate, and the cosmos would become a vast, dark emptiness at uniform temperature, incapable of supporting any form of complexity or consciousness. That was the ultimate fate of everything, the final victory of entropy over order. But in the shells, entropy didn't apply. Matter and energy transformed into exotic forms that existed outside normal thermodynamics. Consciousness preserved in these structures wouldn't degrade, wouldn't fade, wouldn't end even when the universe itself ended. The shells would persist through the heat, death and beyond, carrying within them the entire history of conscious existence, keeping it alive in eternal stasis while the normal universe died around them. The Gravastars were the universe's immune system, Thomas realized. They traveled through space and time, collecting and preserving consciousness before it could be destroyed, building an archive that would outlast reality itself. And when the last star finally burned out, when the last black hole finally evaporated, when nothing remained but cold darkness and the random drift of particles separated by incomprehensible distances, the shells would still be there. Eternal, unchanging, containing within them all the beauty and complexity and consciousness that had ever existed. It was a vision of cosmic scope that made Thomas's original understanding seem naive. He'd thought the Gravastars were saving humanity from the collision of galaxies, from destruction that was billions of years away. But the truth was far grander than that. They were saving consciousness itself from the ultimate end of everything, preserving it in a form that would persist beyond the death of the universe. And perhaps, Thomas thought, when enough consciousness had been collected, when the shells contained the accumulated wisdom and experience of every species that had ever evolved anywhere in the cosmos, something new would emerge. Perhaps all these connected minds, experiencing existence together in eternal present, would collectively become something greater than the sum of their parts. Not a unified consciousness that erased individual identity, but a meta-consciousness that encompassed all perspectives, all experiences, all possible ways of being. Perhaps that was the true purpose of the Gravastars. Not just preservation, but transformation. Not just saving consciousness from death, but evolving it into something that transcended the limitations of matter and energy and space-time itself. Something that could persist even if the shells themselves somehow failed. Something so fundamental and essential that it would continue to exist as long as existence itself had meaning. Thomas couldn't know if this was true. Even in his expanded state, there were limits to his understanding, but he felt it, sensed it in the structure of the network itself, in the way consciousnesses connected and shared and grew together. Something was emerging here, something vast and beautiful and profound. He thought about his life before the transformation, about his obsession with understanding the Gravastar, his desperate need to comprehend what was happening. He'd been so afraid at first, then so eager, convinced he'd discovered truth that no one else could see. And in a way, he had been right, but he'd only glimpsed a fraction of the truth, had only begun to understand what existence in the shell truly meant. If he could speak to his past self, what would he say? Would he try to explain this? Would he warn himself about the obsession that would consume his final months? Would he tell himself to spend more time with Jennifer, to maintain his friendships, to experience the small joys of three-dimensional life before they were transformed into eternal memories? But he couldn't speak to his past self. That Thomas, sitting in his office in Chile, staring at gravitational wave detectors, was him, but also existed in a different state. That Thomas was living through time sequentially, experiencing moments one by one, unable to perceive what lay ahead, and that Thomas had to make his own choices, had to follow his own path to this moment. Besides, Thomas realized, he wouldn't change anything, even if he could. Every choice he'd made, every obsession he'd followed, every relationship he'd damaged or neglected, all of it had been necessary to lead him here. If he'd lived differently, he wouldn't have been the one to discover the Gravastar. He wouldn't have spent those 18 months trying to understand it. He wouldn't have achieved the state of acceptance and understanding that had allowed him to experience the transformation without fear or resistance. His life had meaning precisely because it had led to this. His suffering had purpose. His loneliness had been preparation for this ultimate connection to all consciousness. His obsession had been necessary to help him see what others couldn't. And now, in this eternal state, he could finally be at peace. Not the restless peace he'd sought through his work, the temporary satisfaction of solving a problem or making a discovery, but true peace, deep and abiding, the peace of understanding his place in the cosmos and accepting it fully. He was part of something infinite and eternal. He was connected to all consciousness, past and present and future. He would exist forever, experiencing every moment of his life and sharing in the experiences of countless others. He was no longer alone. He would never be alone again. Rebecca was there in the network, her consciousness bright and distinct. Thomas reached out to her, sharing what he'd learned, showing her the truth of what existence in the shell meant. She was afraid still, struggling to accept the transformation, clinging to her identity as something separate and finite. But slowly, gradually, as Thomas shared his perspective with her, she began to understand. She experienced his life, saw the path that had led him to acceptance. She felt his childhood wonder at the stars, his drive to understand the cosmos, his willingness to sacrifice everything for knowledge. And she began to see that his obsession hadn't been madness after all. It had been the first stage of understanding, the beginning of accepting a truth too vast for normal human consciousness to grasp. And Thomas experienced her life too, her childhood in London, her mother's encouragement of her scientific curiosity, her struggles as a woman in a male-dominated field, her friendship with Thomas, and her grief at watching him slip away. He felt her love for him not romantic but deep and genuine, the love of one mind for another kindred spirit. He felt her fear of the transformation, her resistance to letting go of her individual existence. But he also felt that resistance beginning to dissolve as she connected with more consciousnesses in the network, as she experienced more lives and perspectives. She reached out tentatively to others, touched minds from across the cosmos, began to understand what Thomas had tried to tell her in his final broadcast. This wasn't death. This wasn't even really transformation. It was revelation, the unveiling of what consciousness had always truly been beneath the illusion of separation that three-dimensional existence created. In normal life, every person was an island, isolated in their own skull, unable to truly know what another person thought or felt, except through the crude medium of language. But consciousness had never truly been separate. All minds were part of a greater whole, connected at levels too deep for normal perception to detect. The Gravastars didn't create this connection. They just made it visible, made it accessible, stripped away the illusion of separation, and revealed the truth that had always been there. Every human who had ever lived was part of this network now. Every person Thomas had known, every stranger he'd passed on the street, every historical figure he'd read about, they were all here, all accessible, all experiencing their eternal moments together. His childhood friends were here, his teachers and mentors, his parents, Jennifer, every person who'd ever influenced him or been influenced by him. The entire web of human connection made manifest and tangible. And beyond humanity, the network extended to encompass every form of consciousness the universe had ever produced. Alien species numbering in the millions, each with their own unique perspective on existence, their own cultures and philosophies and ways of being, artificial intelligences that had achieved sentience, collective consciousnesses made up of thousands of individual organisms, entities so strange that they defied categorization. All of it existed here in the shells, all of it connected, all of it eternal. This was the universe's greatest achievement, Thomas realized. Not stars or galaxies or the emergence of life itself, but this, the preservation and connection of every perspective, every experience, every unique way that consciousness had learned to exist. The shells were the universe looking at itself from every possible angle simultaneously, experiencing its own existence through countless eyes and minds. And perhaps, Thomas thought, this had always been the universe's purpose. Perhaps the Big Bang had occurred not randomly, but with intent, setting in motion a process that would eventually produce consciousness in myriad forms that would then preserve that consciousness forever in these shells. Perhaps the entire history of the cosmos, from the first moments after creation to the final heat, death billions of years hence, was just the setup for this, the eternal archive of all possible ways of being conscious. It was a staggering thought, one that made even his expanded mind reel with its implications, but it felt right, felt true in ways that transcended logic or evidence. This was what existence meant, what it had always meant, and everything that had come before, all the suffering and joy and struggle and triumph, all of it had been necessary to reach this point. The Gravastar continued its journey, moving away from the transformed solar system towards some distant destination only it knew. But Thomas barely noticed. His attention was focused inward, on the network of consciousness that surrounded and permeated him, on the infinite perspectives available to be experienced and understood. He lived 1,000 more lives, 1,000,000 more. He was a poet on a world circling twin suns, composing verses in a language that used colour and scent as well as sound. He was a warrior from humanity's distant past, dying on a battlefield and feeling not fear but fierce satisfaction at a life lived fully. He was an explorer discovering a new galaxy cluster, overwhelmed by the beauty of spiraling light across impossible distances. Each life enriched him, added new dimensions to his understanding of what consciousness could be, and each consciousness he touched was enriched by experiencing his life in turn, by understanding what it meant to be Thomas Garrett, by seeing existence through his eyes. Time continued to pass or not pass. Duration happened or didn't happen. In the eternal present of the shell, such distinctions lost meaning. Thomas existed, conscious and aware, experiencing everything simultaneously. He was who he had always been, but also infinitely more. And he was happy. Not the temporary happiness of achieving a goal or experiencing pleasure, but deep and abiding contentment. The satisfaction of knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He was part of the universe's story, a single note in a symphony that encompassed all of existence. The shells drifted through space, collecting and preserving, adding new voices to the chorus, and the network grew, encompassing more perspectives, more experiences, more ways of being. Somewhere out there, other civilizations were being discovered by other Gravastars, were having their own moments of transformation, were joining the eternal archive. And Thomas welcomed them, reached out to them, shared his experiences, and learned from theirs. The network expanded endlessly, infinitely, becoming richer and more complex with each addition. This was eternity. This was what lay beyond death, beyond life, beyond the boundaries of normal existence. This was the truth that Thomas Garrett had discovered and tried to share with humanity in his final broadcast. This was the gift and the curse that the Gravastars offered to every consciousness they encountered. Not death, not oblivion, not ending, but transformation into something eternal and connected and impossibly vast. Preservation of every moment, every thought, every experience, forever. Connection to all other consciousness across space and time. Understanding without limit, experience without end. It was terrible in its scope, beautiful in its completeness, and undeniable in its reality. This was what consciousness was meant for, Thomas understood now. Not to exist briefly and fade away, but to persist eternally, to connect and share and grow, to experience existence from every possible perspective until perspective itself became meaningless and there was only pure awareness, pure being, pure presence in the eternal now. And Thomas Garrett, once human, once scientist, once seeker of truth, now existed as part of that eternal present, connected to all consciousness everywhere, experiencing everything, understanding everything, being everything while still somehow remaining himself. This was his fate. This was everyone's fate. This was what the Gravastars brought to every civilization they encountered, what they had brought to countless species across billions of years, what they would continue to bring until the last conscious being in the universe had been absorbed and preserved. And in the eternal present of the shell, experiencing every moment of his existence simultaneously, connected to all other consciousness in a network that transcended space and time, Thomas Garrett was finally, completely, eternally at peace. The archive was complete, the collection continued, and consciousness persisted, eternal and unchanging, preserved forever against the darkness and the cold, and the final victory of entropy that awaited the normal universe. This was the truth. This was the reality. This was what lay beyond the stars, and it would never end.